Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. We're going to try to carry on with our notes for Rita Dove's poem, Pomade. 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 Still having a sort of funny relationship to the pronunciation of that noun. Okay. Pomade. Form. This should actually be form and figures. So in my last video, we looked at listened for sound and sense in the poem. We've already counted beans, but now we have to describe form and figures, figurative language in the poem. So the first few issues of form that pop out to me in terms of the poem's shape, its arrangement, the relation of its parts together. The first thing that stands out is the title. The title to me, because the word does not appear anywhere in the poem, but we get at the end of line 2 an account, I think, of Willema teaching or teaching Beulah how to make this pomade for themselves, and so lines 13 through 16 seem to be where we see that. And so the title names something that appears at the end of stanza 2. But as we talked about before, each of the stanzas start to develop in a different way. By a kind of chain of association, different aspects of of this. It's not the speaker, the primary figure's relationship to this person, Willema, from the past. So we do have to sort of think about how that first line prepares us for that memory of Willema teaching the narrator something, the narrator teaching Beulah something. But the significance of why that image in particular stands out is a little unclear, because it could have been Rita Dove could have chosen a word relating to some of these other images as well, but we don't get those. So, okay. So we'll see what we see there. But then I think first and last stanzas also are significant. That first one sort of setting the stage for Beulah's memory. We see here in line 2, as soon as line 2, that the activity of cleaning up after her husband triggers a memory, but then it's a chain of associations. The memory of her husband often being gone makes her think of Willema, makes her think of what Willema teaches her, and we get a sort of quick biography, or quick biography of their relationship, or of Willema's role in their home before coming back to the last to the last before coming back to the present here in the last stanza. So I think there's that. Um, we might think of the poem's relationship to elegy, the sense of loss, loss of the past, the sense of a husband who's absent or who seems marked by a kind of absence, um, off forever, as it were. In the first part of the poetry collection, Thomas and Beulah attends to his perspective and his relationship to that magic creek, husband's absence, but then of course Willema as teacher, sister, and a kind of spirit in a way. Okay. I mean, it's not necessarily an explicit elegy. Elegies are often in the first person, sometimes directly addressing the lost one. And instead, what we have here is a kind of arrangement by a third, from a sort of third person perspective, Beulah reckoning in a kind of mundane everyday situation the the sense of loss around her. This is probably tied to the short sentence at the end that I reflected on in my previous video, nothing ever stops. Okay. So those would be some things I'd think about. But then also the chain reaction of association, memory association as a kind of genre of organization, um, and how relation to the stanzas and the sentences, the stanza shift, the sentence shifts, um, sort of flow according to that logic of association. So we might wonder about that association as a kind of secondary supplemental organizing principle of the poem, thinking about Willem helping with children, to Willem teaching the narrator teaching Beulah something. Ugh, showing my training here, just defaulting to think of the primary figure as the speaker when she isn't, or is not positioned as the speaker here anyway. The reflection on the sort of general geography of that Tennessee cabin's position, reflections on the character of Willema, willing to walk 5 miles for Scotch tape, but not for much else, largely staying inside, taping things up to the window pane in order to have protection from the sun, a little bit of darkness in the middle of the day. Um, and then the association with smell, with a sort of scaling up of Willema's sort of in placeness to a kind of sense of itineracy or moving around. Willema's association with distant places. Mm. And then thinking of her death and then coming back to the present. So each of that sense of association, we might think of each step and what fold of significance does the poem introduce there. Realizing I'm moving my hands a lot. Guess I just banged my microphone stand here. Okay, so I think that's probably it for form. That in terms of form, all I want to say there for now. I would have to come back and really dig in if I wanted to think about that, but okay. What's changed? Developed. Some of these things I reflected on last time when going over the prose sense, but figurative language. We do have some instances of figurative language here. Some instances of figurative language here. So let's maybe go through and think about this. We kind of have metonymy in that first line. Riverbed standing in for, you know, let's call it mud plus, like whatever Thomas is sort of tracked in with him. Um, and we can think then sweeps the kitchen floor of the riverbed. That metonymy calls up such a rich image of Thomas bringing that whole natural object into the kitchen, and Beulah's kind of domestic chore isn't then scaled up to an almost epic level of actually attempting then to remove an entire river from a riverbed from the kitchen. And so the metonymy there functioning as a kind of scaling up or exaggerative move. Okay. The metaphoric description of the flowers, hmm, of the flower as, hmm, hmm, as having a spiked collar and a crown of worms, right? And the way this metaphoric or analogic kind of description works is by way of a similar sort of association we have with the functioning of memory. Um, Recalling a flower and simply using language for what its shape reminds her of. Um, and worm could be giving texture, it could be giving color, it could be giving all kinds of things. And yet it's also a somewhat surprising description because we might not think of something looking like a crown of worms as being appealing. And yet worms also has a kind of associative relationship given their location in the ground, flowers coming up out of the ground, right? Um, okay, so that's something there. Do we have anything in stanza two in terms of figurative language? Doesn't doesn't necessarily look like it. Okay. Slant of heaven, a kind of metonymy for, or metonym for, is that the shape of sky? Shape of sky? Trajectory or connection between places? We have some personification as well with the soup. Soup yearned, for instance. Uh, Cornbread climbed in glory. Okay. Some instances there. Nothing there. Okay, what else do we see? Fragments always. And then the smell. We have the simile of smell like travel. I was thinking before I started recording how sometimes when you use the word like in reference to sensuous verbs, what does it taste like? What does it smell like? It's not really so much a simile that's happening there. It's just a kind of straight up comparison. This tastes like chicken is not necessarily, I guess it's a kind of figure of speech, but it's more on the level of the literal. There's a sense I'm feeling that is the same as this other thing, or is kind of giving this other sensation. But here, the way in which just the word travel doesn't have a kind of sensuous a sensuous connotation to it that's all that clear. So to say that something smells like travel gets you thinking in a way that saying it smells like a rose doesn't really kick up interpretive work, right? Um, And so there's a way in which there's a simile that then links you to a metonymy. Travel is standing in for a whole cluster of different possible sensations that might differ reader to reader, poet to poet. Okay. Um, then we have the somewhat, somewhat problematic simile here at the end. Although I'm less interested in how it's problematic, it certainly wouldn't be a simile I would use in a poem now, and Rita Dove, I imagine, might not either, or maybe not. Uh, but we still, this is what we have, and so we have to sort of wonder the significance of that there. Um, Catfish grins like an oriental gentleman. Um, there's some work in Asian American studies, and in Black American studies as well, about sort of um, affective inscrutability, and how that a kind of affective or emotional inscrutability is often coded in literature and culture and by a sort of white dominant discourse as a way to sort of complain about or worry um, about others, right? People who don't don't look white or who don't react to um, situations the way sort of a dominant cultural position would want them to act. And so I wonder if Dove, for better or worse, is sort of drawing on that discourse here, seeing this catfish grin. Of course, the catfish isn't grinning, um, but projecting a kind of significance that is difficult to read onto this catfish as if it's responding to this train of thought she's been on. And then, of course, we have that personification there too. The dead catfish grins. I think it's dead. I mean, I assume it is if it's just sitting on the countertop, but maybe not. Uh, okay, so actually quite a lot. I was sort of ready to move through the poem and think about how it's a poem that resists a lot of figurative language, but there's actually quite a lot of it. Metonymy, metaphor, personification, simile throughout, and a lot of it requiring slowing down and unpacking and thinking about what it is one is doing. Okay. Okay, form and figures then. Ideas and questions. I think I already have hit on quite a few ideas and questions earlier in my but maybe we can um, think just a bit about what the poem leaves us with. Just now realizing the smoothing of hair here at the end, smoothing her hair, then sniffs her palms, right? That's also a reference to the pomade, pomade, pomade. So those are lines. What are those lines? 40 something, 41 to 42. Okay. So that title showing up at the end of stanza two and then showing up in the final stanza, seeming significant there, right? So that's making me think then, what role does sensation play? Sensation play here. Texture, So the sense of touch, texture, smell, right? We have the smell like travel, but then we have the sniffing of the palms, um, the sense of the heated materials that go into the pomade, also then kind of giving off this sense of exhalation, giving off a sense of odor, right? And not in a negative sense, but an odor that can be experienced. Because I hadn't noticed that before. And the flowers aren't necessarily the flowers aren't necessarily described as having a scent, but one could imagine they would. Then of course the sense is tied to the river and catfish, right? That could have been there. And then we have the sense of rubbing the petals done too. And are the petals from the flower? Huh, I guess I hadn't thought about that. Um, Maybe we're calling a flower lines 3 through 6. Petals used for mixture. I don't know. Okay. And then the sort of landscape imagery, or sky imagery, right? Throughout the food, not quite tasted, but on the verge of tasting, or being tasted, the verge of being tasted. Just even that idea of the cast iron pan as having a black lip. Of course, it does have a black lip, but the cast iron pan having a lip also has that double connotation then of being personified as being a kind of mouth with a lip, right? Hmm. Okay. So yeah, so sensation matters here in ways I hadn't quite noticed before on a first read through. Hmm. Hmm. As elegy, a sense of mourning and loss, but also, is there a sense of celebration or hmm, honoring honoring the dead? So for instance, I think there's some ambiguity around what nothing ever stops means. I think in my previous video I linked it with the experience I had after my father died, the uncanny sense of the world, that the world just keeps going even though one of the most important people in your life is dead, right? But maybe there's a positive valence to that as well, that simply when in the middle of cleaning up after your husband who's made a big mess, Willema comes back. Oh gosh. Oof. And how powerful uh, those memories can be. Uh, I mean, the last two lines don't seem all that positive. She feels herself slowly rolling down the sides of the earth. But maybe that's not a totally unpleasant sensation. I don't know. Uh, Okay. Some things there. Some things there. What a profound thing. What a profound statement. Yeah. Going back up to form, ellipses in stanza 3, also serving as a kind of articulation of the two halves of that. I think that's the longest stanza, and how we move from that sort of geographical location of the cabin uh, to the sort of rich description of food, which presumably Willema makes. I don't know if that's the implication. And also, I guess I hadn't noticed that before. The cabin leaning, lemma standing straight. But there is a link between the cabin itself and the sister-in-law. Okay. Mm. Role of indirection here. Never the pomade, the title never directly incorporated, right? Traces in stanzas 1 and is it 5 or 6? And 5. More direct, description in stanza 2, but the word itself is never used in the poem, or in the lines of the poem anyway. And so we might think about how that dynamic of indirection actually works in other ways throughout the poem to set the scene for us, but never quite, not quite explicitly. We have to kind of work for it. It's made through suggestion. And even the idea, if you're reading this poem in isolation, even the idea that you don't know Beulah's name until the last stanza, you kind of have to work out who Thomas is and infer maybe that Thomas is the name of the husband, that Willem then, because of the line quite late here, line 29, I think, or 28, that Thomas and Willem are siblings. That Tennessee is a place that Beulah and her husband lived before, wherever they are living now in the present moment of the poem, right? And we might think then about how indirection is part of that logic that's also connected to the movement of memory, of association, to the functioning of figurative language, and maybe even to I don't know. Yeah, I still haven't quite figured out this shift in caesura, the increased frequency of periods in the last part, and how that might be connected with some of these other dynamics I'm seeing. Could it be that they are a kind of winding, gives a kind of sense of winding down, of slowing down, of reflecting after the heat of memories association, a sense of coming back out of memory. Hmm. I don't know. Link between caesura period frequency and the connections made between figurative language, elegy, memory, sensation. Do we slow down near the end as we come up out of reflection, entering a state of comment, of response after a kind of meditative slip into the stream of the past? Okay, I don't know. Maybe. Maybe. That's always kind of my answer to things. Context. Let's sketch some possible contexts, and we'll wrap up these notes today on this incredible poem. Readers, of course, scholars of contemporary poetry, of African American poetry. And I say that because that's sort of crucial in some ways to the if there's a story, the story that the whole collection of Thomas and Beulah tells about these two figures, and certainly the idea that this relationship is coded by racial difference, or blackness, is we see this in the third stanza with a reference to the colored cemetery. Scholars of contemporary poetry, African American poetry. What else? Hmm. Thinking about it with respect to, say, 20th century elegy. Okay. My answer, in some sense, to I think I say this every time I go over contexts, is always going to be, what are the experts saying, right, about this poem? About this poem. Okay. Uh, Self culture. Of course, of blackness being maybe of particular importance here. Particular importance here. Um, hmm. Importance of river, of fishing, of hair care. Too about the kind of maybe Orientalism in American poetry, and maybe in African American poetry too. I'm just kind of curious about what role, say, the reference to Turkey, to these sort of towers associated with mosques, I think, and then the reference to the Oriental gentleman here at the end, what role these might play in a kind of image repertoire of whether it's Rita Dove's image repertoire, or whether that's a repertoire she shares with other American poets, other Black American poets. It seems significant. Poetry too of the domestic scene. The cabin while the husband's out fishing, but we don't follow the husband as we do in the first part of the poem, but we stay with Beulah. And there's quite a few poems in the second part dedicated to Beulah's perspective that reflect on that. Reflect on that. Um, so I think of Black feminism too, or womanism. Bell Hooks's word that might be of some significance here. Thinking about the relationship, especially between Black women. Okay. All right. So self culture, readers. I don't know. Yeah, concepts a little tough. Typical literary terms, genres that sort of stand out. Elegy, metaphor, metonymy, caesura. Like I'm not digging much deeper beyond just those terms. Roll of time and lyric verse. There's maybe thinking of some scholars who've written a bit about how poetry, verse poetry, lyric poetry affords certain temporal locations and dislocations. So that might be something I'd pull up here, since the poem is pulling us into the past and then rushing back to the present at the end. Hmm. So about the world, full collection. Thomas and Beulah. Dove's other work. Dove's essays. 20th century imaginings of black migration across the United States. Because to some degree, that's also what the collection's about, is sort of imagining, sort of backwards from the 1980s, the movement of I don't even think it's the previous generation. I think it's the grandparents' generation. If you're an adult in the 1980s, thinking backwards, of the lives of your grandparents, the young lives of your grandparents before they met, when they got married, and then the various places they've lived. That seems pretty deeply important to, developing a context for a richer effort at close reading, or accounting for this poem or the collection itself. All right, so one maybe last bit. Again, let's read the poem one more time. I know we're approaching the 40-minute mark here, but let's read it one more time and then just see if something occurs to us, or occurs to me, that hadn't occurred to me before. So as a way to wind down, let's hear it one more time. This is Rita Dove's Pomade. She sweeps the kitchen floor of the riverbed her husband saw fit to bring home with his catfish, recalling a flower, very straight, with a spiked collar arching under a crown of bright, fluffy worms, she had gathered in armfuls along a still road in Tennessee. Even then, he was forever off in the woods somewhere in search of a magic creek. It was Willemma shushed the pack of dusty children and took her inside the leaning cabin with its little window in the door, the cut-out magazine cloud taped to the pane. So's I'll always have shade. It was Willemma showed her how to rub the petals fine and heat them slow in mineral oil until the skillet exhaled pears and nuts and rotting fir. That cabin leaned straight away to the south, took the very slant of heaven through the crabgrass and Queen Anne's lace to the colored cemetery down in Wartrace. Barley soup yearned toward the bowl's edge. The cornbread, hot from the oven, climbed in glory to the very black lip of the cast-iron pan. But Willemma stood straight as the day. She walked 5 miles to town for Scotch tape and back again. Gaslight flickered on the cockeyed surface of rainwater in a galvanized pail in the corner while Thomas pleaded with his sister to get out while she still was fit. Bee balm. The fragrance always put her in mind of Turkish minarets against a sky wrenched blue, sweet and merciless. Willemma could wear her gray hair twisted into knots at the temples and still smell like travel. But all those years she didn't budge. She simply turned one day from slicing a turnip into a pot when her chest opened and the inrushing air knocked her down. Call the Reverend, I'm in the floor, right? She called out to a passer-by. Beulah gazes through the pale speckled linoleum to the webbed loam with its salt and worms. She smooths her hair, then sniffs her palms. On the countertop, the catfish grins like an oriental gentleman. Nothing ever stops. She feels herself slowly rolling down the sides of the earth, slowly rolling. It's a beautiful phrase. some things that I may have noticed the first time I read the poem is as a reader, you might be anticipating that to be an on instead of an in. I'm on the floor. I'm in the floor. That in having a somewhat, I don't know, sort of morbid, foreboding connotation to it. That also links with the final stanza and Beulah kind of gazing through the linoleum to the ground beneath it. Right. I'm in the floor. In the floor. This line read differently to me this time because I read blue, sweet, and merciless as a list there, as opposed to a sky wrenched blue, sweet, and merciless. I read it as a sky wrenched blue, sweet, and merciless. I'm not sure if that's quite right, but still. I hadn't also thought or considered that my gosh, I'm so slow here, right? The stanza 4 is also referencing the title, right? So 30, 30 to 33 is also referencing the pomade. Right, and that or maybe back in the present, even here in this stanza, that Beulah is thinking about her, but then smells the bee balm, thinks again about Willema and her hair, right? Hmm. And the smell of her hair. Okay. Yeah, some things I just haven't noticed before. Also, the first stanza's pretty tricky, right? Because the syntax here is calling a flower she had gathered in armfuls, so leaping from line 3 to 6. But then this embedded description of the flower kind of interrupts that syntax, and it's a little awkward, and I think purposefully so, maybe. Right. Okay. Well, let's stop there. Just pointing out some things that maybe I hadn't commented on, and I'm not sure if it's important, but oh, one more thing, that we have the leaning cabin here, which sort of seeds then the reference to the leaning cabin there, which is then contrasted with Will Emma standing straight as the day she walked 5 miles to town for Scotch tape and back again, which I think that I also read a little differently. Um, that memory of her walking that far just for tape is an example of how straight she stood, right? How straight she stood. Okay. Well, thanks if you've made it this far. Thanks for spending even more time with Rita Dove in this amazing poem. And hey, let's keep going. And let's read more poems tomorrow.